By the end of this video, you will have met just about all the uses of the participle in the Gospel of John, starting with those that are most frequently found. Hi, Rob McIver here. Let's talk about participles in John, making them as easy to understand as possible. By the way, if you're looking for examples of a particular use of the participle, you can probably find them by moving your cursor to the bottom of the screen and skipping forward to that section. Now, as I note in my definition of a participle found in my textbook, Intermediate New Testament Greek Made Easier, participles sometimes act like an adjective, sometimes like an adverb, and sometimes have a different relationship to the main verb. Now, in the Gospel of John, by far the most common use of a participle is like an adjective. In fact, a massive 58% of them are used like that. And the great news is, these are the easier to understand participles. That's really good news. 27% of them are found in adverbial uses, and then 15% of them are found in other uses. So that's the overview. Let's get down to some specifics. So there are two kinds of adjectival use, and I've listed there 10 adverbial uses of the participle, and also 4 other uses. That makes 16 uses all up, doesn't it? So we're trying to make participles easier to understand, and if you look at the percentages of uses, we can see already that there is a good starting point. Let's concentrate on the use of the participle that are found more frequently. And here are the ones we're going to be talking about first. We're going to have to cover the others, but let's meet the more commonly found types of participles first. And the great news is 43% of participles are used as a substantive. And after an initial mild shock, substantive uses of participles are very easy to identify and understand. So if participles are used like adjectives, let's begin by actually reminding ourselves how adjectives are used in John. The first example there is kind of interesting. Hoi eudaioi. Well, it's used 25 times in John, meaning the Jews. And we'll leave aside the question why a Jewish writer writing about a Jesus who was a Jew and his disciples who were Jews working in a Jewish context talked about the Jews, especially in such a negative way throughout his gospel, and just concentrate on the grammar. Because eudaioi is actually an adjective. Eudaios, eudaia, eudaion, which means from Judea or Jewish. So put an article in front of it, you turn an adjective into a noun-like thing, a substantive. Ha, hagios, the Holy One. Tous necrous, the dead. Hoi, necroi, the dead. Tu paneru, of the evil one. Tu tuflu, of the blind person. To flow, to the blind person. Ente aramo. And again, aramo is just meaning a desolate or a desert place. And te aramo is in a desolate place or in the desert. Now here we have some examples of where a participle is used in exactly that way. We put an article in front of it and it turns a participle into something like a noun, a substantive. So, ho katabinon, the one who comes down. Ho menon, the one who remains. Ho paradidus, the one who delivers over. Hoi pistusantis, those that believe. And I have an example here in John 13:20. Hot lambanon antina pimpsoma lambano. Hot lambanon Labani ton pimpsenta me. Ho lambanon, the one who receives, the one who sent me, receives me. Hoda me lambanon, the one who receives me, receives the one who sent me. As you can see, we have the verb lambano. You turn it into a participle, you put an article in front of it, is the one who. Now, at first, this seems kind of strange to put an article in front of a participle to make a substantive, but it occurs many, many times in John. A massive 43% of participles are used in this way. And in fact, I gathered together this type of use of participle in an appendix of my book, Beginning New Testament Greek Made Easier. And as you run your eye down the example, you will see a pattern emerging. Ho agapone, the one who loves. Ho me agapone, the one who does not love. Ho akaluthone, the one who follows. And these are in actual alphabetical order, as you can see. So further down, we find ho elthone, the one who comes. And what you can have is little phrases inserted between the article and the participle. So ho eis ton kosmon erkomenos is the one who is coming into the world. Ho erkomenos by itself is the one who is coming. Ho episo mu erkomenos, the one who is coming after me. Other examples. Ho lambanon, the one who receives. Ho pisteuon, the one who believes. Ho de me pisteuon, the one who does not believe. Ho poion, the one who does. Yes. As you work through these, you'll become much more confident in recognizing and in translating this type of participle. If we're looking for participles made easier, certainly after the initial shock, this is a reasonably straightforward use of the participle. Now, there's a couple of variations on this we find in John. We have an article with two participles. Both of them are substantive. So we have ho hestekos kai akuon, the one who stands and hears. Ho zoen kain pisteuon, the one who lives and believes in me. The article can be separated from the participle by a combination of other things, adjectives, nouns, etc. So we have ho eis ton kosmon erkomenos, the one who has come into the world. Ho aphiortou lelon, the one who speaks of himself. John 5:29. All right, so let's look at this. And they will go out. Hoi puisantis, those who did. Ta agatha, those who did the good. Eis anastasin zoen, to the resurrection of life. Hoi de faula praxantis, those who did evil. Eis anastasin chrysios, to the resurrection of judgment. So that is the most common use of participles found in John. Add an article and you form a substantive. Now, sometimes participles are used pretty much as we'd expect actual adjectives to be used, and these are called attributive adjectival participles. Let's look at some attributive adjectives in John. Attributive adjectives describe an attribute of a noun and follow predictable patterns in the New Testament. And these patterns are mirrored by the way attributive adjectival participles are formed. A simple pattern is that of a noun followed by an adjective. And you'll notice something immediately here. English wants to put an adjective first before the noun. Greek usually puts the adjective after the noun. So we have pneuma, spirit, hagion, holy. So, Holy Spirit. Pater, hagia, Father Holy or Holy Father. Zoane, ionion, life eternal. Well, isn't that interesting? We don't mind the adjective eternal coming after life, and I think that's probably because we've heard it so often in the King James Version. Ergon kala, good works, and anthropon tuflon, a blind man. In an almost exact analogy, a participle can follow a noun just like an adjective. In such cases, it's called an attributive adjectival participle because it's describing an attribute of its associated noun. For example, we have here hudatos zontos. So here is the present participle of the verb zao, and we put it after hudatos, which is the genitive case of water, and the participle will be in the genitive case, like adjectives have the same number in cases their associated noun. So the participle has the same number of case as its associated noun. Hudatos zontos, living water. Yeah, it actually works in English as well. Living is the English participle. Egeneto anthropos apostelmenos para theo. A man appeared who was sent by God. Caiaphas archairus on to aniotu ekainu. Literally, Caiaphas, high priest, being of that year. All right, so how do we translate that? Caiaphas, who was high priest of that year. And we have on explaining what kind of high priest Caiaphas was. He was the high priest of that year. Adjectives use several patterns, not just noun followed by an adjective. Sometimes there is an article followed by an adjective followed by a noun. Now, this is, in fact, the same word order that is used in English. He aionios zoein, the eternal life. To monu theo, the only God. En te eskete chimera, in the last day. Tain dekaien chrisen, the righteous judgment or the correct judgment. So all of those are in the pattern article, adjective, noun, and translate pretty much word for word into English. A similar pattern is observable with participles. We have in John 6:57, hozon pater, the living Father, ton legomenon kriniou topon. Well, here we have ton topon, the place, and the place called legomenon, skull, craniou. Ta graphomena biblia, the books, the written books. And another pattern used by adjectives in the New Testament is article, noun, article, adjective. So, to phos, to alephinon, the light, the true, or in English, the true light. To pneuma, to hagion, the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. Participles can be found in the same pattern. We have article, noun, article, participle. Ho hudor, to zone, the water, the living water. Ho prophetes, ho erchomenos, eis ton cosmon. Well, if it was just ho prophetes, ho erchomenos, we could say the coming prophet. But because we've got to get eis ton cosmon into the mix, it's the prophet who is coming into the world. And ho artos, ho ektu uranu katabainon. So you can see that between the article and the participle, we have the phrase ektu uranu, and it's ho katabanon, the one who comes down out of heaven, and it's the bread, ho artos, the bread that is coming down from heaven. So those were the two kinds of adjectival participles. And if we look at our pie chart, we can see that adjectival participles account for more than half of the participles used in John. The largest segments left on our graph are the temporal adverbial participles, the adverbial participle of attendant circumstances, and perhaps the pleonastic adverbial participles. And as well as that, we've got complementary and periphrastic. So let's begin by looking at temporal adverbial participles. Temporal adverbial participles are translated with the words when, while, after, etc. So let's look at some examples. Tora I pen en synagogen didascon en Capharnaum. So these things he said while teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum. Torta de ipon ortes eminen en te Galilee. So when he said these things, he remained in Galilee, or perhaps better, after he said these things, he remained in Galilee. Torta de palin deuteron Simeon epoiasin ho Jesus elthon ectes Judaeus eistain Galilean. This again was the second sign Jesus did as he was going from Judea into Galilee. So that is while or as, it's the time within which. Torta ada triton ephinothe Jesus tois methetais egerthais ek necron. This was already the third time Jesus appeared to the disciples after he rose from the dead. Now, I've gone quite quickly through these because I wanted you to see the pattern. Each of these participles is translated with some reference to time. When, while, after, something like that. Now, you're going to ask me, Rob, when do I use when and when do I use after? Well, it's a bit trickier. In fact, in my book, Intermediate New Testament Greek Made Easier, in chapter 15, I have quite a long section explaining when you use when and when you use after. And there is a video that also does this. So because this is sort of a survey of participles in John, so I'll refer you to those other two possible sources for further information. But at this stage, all we will say is when, while, after are all possible translations, and sometimes you can tell which is best by looking at the context. The next most frequently found use of participle in John is the adverbial participle of attendant circumstances. Now, the name we use is a bit of a clue on how the participle is used. It's used to describe circumstances that are true or attendant to the action of the main verb. Let's look at some examples and then do some further thinking about it. So, ho paragon, eiden, anthropon, tuflon, ek genetos. And as he's going along, he saw a man blind from birth. So paragon, that's the circumstance attendant to the action of the main verb, eiden. As he was going along, he saw akusen Jesus hoti exebalon orton exo. So Jesus heard he'd been thrown out of the synagogue. Kai huron orton ipen, and finding him, he said, Su pistuais eiston huion to anthropu. Do you believe in the Son of Man? So we have huron is the attendant circumstance to Jesus ipen, Jesus speaking. So when he found him, he spoke. Well, here we see that the participle of attendant circumstance could also be almost a temporal adverbial participle. More of that later. Now, in the early verses of John 13, we find a number of participles of attendant circumstances. And you can see from these verses how powerful these participles can be. Proto tes hiortes to Pascha, so before the feast of Passover. Eidos ho Jesus, Jesus knowing, hoti althen orto he chora, his hour had come. Hina metabe ecto cosmo tortu proston phaetera, to be taken out of this world and to all the Father. Agapeses ton idion, loving his own. Tous in to cosmo, those that are in the world. Eis ton telos, agapesen or tous. He loved them to the end. All right, so let's analyze this verse. First, find the main verb. The main verb is, in fact, agapesen. He loved them, eis telos, to the end. That's the main clause of the sentence. He loved them to the end. We find that there were two attendant circumstances that are identified by these two adverbial participles of attendant circumstances. Jesus knew that his hour had come and he was going to leave this world and go to the Father, and he loved his own that are in the world, and therefore he loved them to the end. I've already mentioned that there's a bit of a fuzzy line between temporal adverbial participles and adverbial participles of attendant circumstances. So how do we tell which is which? Well, there's quite a good discussion of this in this book by Daniel Wallace. And in my book, Intermediate New Testament Greek Made Easier, I've made a little summary of what I think are his key points. He notes that a participle of attendant circumstances is usually in the aorist tense. It precedes the main verbs, and such participles are found more frequently in the Gospels and Acts than elsewhere in the New Testament. So they are typical of narratives. In fact, there's a section in here where we analyze the moods of all the verbs in Acts, and there's a great number of participles of attendant circumstances in Acts, in the narrative of Acts. So we have an example there of a couple of places where the attendant circumstances just help the narrative along. And then we have in John 13 there an example where a participle of attendant circumstances makes some pretty strong theological points. Now, even though less than 4% of participles are pleonastic, it's probably worth looking at them here. The word pleonastic means redundant, and pleonastic participles can be seen as redundant in some way, although they're very close to adverbial participles of manner, as we will discover later. So it is possible that we could classify pleonastic adverbial participles as adverbial participles of manner, but textbooks tend to identify them as pleonastic, so let's just follow along with the crowd on this particular instance. So, for example, legon, legontes, legusa, legusai are all used as pleonastic participles in John, and there are a couple of examples there that will show you how they are used. So, epikrithe or tos ho Ioannes legon. So John answered them, saying. So in English, the saying is redundant, although Greek happily puts it in there, and you could argue that this is how John answered them. The manner in which he answered was by saying instead of writing or indicating with a shrugged shoulder or something. Hota un eidon or ton ho archaeurus kai ho huperetai ekrao gadson legontis. Therefore, when the high priest and the servants saw him, they cried out, saying. So again, in English, that word saying is probably redundant, pleonastic, and we describe that as a pleonastic use of the participle there in John. Now, there are a good number of complementary participles in John. So I've put a number of them here. The result's a fairly busy slide, but it gives you an idea of how complementary participles work. They're not truly adverbial. They're found with a verb, but they complement the verb. They fill out the meaning of the verb rather than modify the verb. Let's begin talking about complementary participles by looking at the verb horeo, which I'm sure you remember has the aorist eidon. So, eidon ho Jesus ton Nathaniel erchomenon pros orton. Jesus saw Nathaniel coming to him. Now that actually works naturally in English, doesn't it? The English verb I see, or past tense I saw, is naturally associated with the present participle. He sees Nathaniel coming. He sees John fishing. He sees, etc., which is very similar to how complementary verbs are used in New Testament Greek. Take, for example, the verb theoreo, which also means see. So, theorosin ton Iesiun peripatunta epites thalassa. They see Jesus walking upon the sea. We have erchomai, aorist althon, althon ego en hudati baptizon. I came baptizing with water. Again, that fits naturally with our English usage. So, complementary participles are found with verbs such as akuo, blepo, erchomai, echo, theomai, theoreo, and horao in the Greek New Testament. And we find examples in John of each one of those verbs used with a complementary participle. Participles are also used in John to construct periphrastic tenses. These are tenses constructed out of a form of the verb to be followed by a participle. So we have here an example in John 1:28. Torta in Bethany egeneto hopu ein ho Ioannes baptizon. These things took place in Bethany, where John was baptizing. Hopu ga ein beblemenos eis tein phulakein ho Ioannes. For John had not yet been thrown into prison. Ein de kai ho Petros met orton estos kai therminomenos. And Peter was standing with them and warming himself. In 6:45, we find Estin gegramenon entois prophetais. It is written, or more correctly, it has been written in the prophets. And in fact, Estin gegramenon is found 5 times in John, although one of them, the words are in an opposite order. And ein gegramenon, was written, is found twice. And John is unique in the New Testament for combining those two words. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and also in John, it is more usual to refer to a fulfillment of Scripture by using the passive gegraptai. It has been written. Now, when we look at the whole of the New Testament, there's a range of periphrastic tenses, and there is a section in Intermediate New Testament Greek Made Easier, which deals with periphrastic tenses and their various types. That is found in chapter 15, section 9. Now, these are the more common uses of participles in John. And while it is good to begin with the common uses, every so often you're going to meet a participle that can't be classified by any of the uses we have looked at. Some of these uses occur 5 times or less in John, but when you're dealing with one of those verses, you need to know about it. And so to be comprehensive in our coverage of the participles in John, we need to include even those that are not found very frequently. We're going to begin with a set of adverbial participles that are used between 5 and 10 times. So this is causal, concessive, and adverbial participles of purpose. Here are some examples of some causal participles. Torta de afhiorto uk ipen, al achirus on to eniutu ekainu eprofutusen hotter. This is about Caiaphas, and it says he did not say this of himself, but because he was high priest that year, he prophesied. And in John 2:23, we read, Hosta ein entois Jerusalemos, ente pascha ente hiote, pola pisdusen eis onoma ortu theoruntes ortu ta semia ha epoiai. Now, here's an interesting one. As he was, or while he was in Jerusalem at the Feast of Passover, many believed in his name because they saw the signs which he did, or after they saw the signs which he did. I think it's probably a causal participle, but you can see that there's an opportunity to perhaps translate that as a temporal adverbial participle as well. And towards the end of the video, we'll take up some of these kind of ambiguous examples. So how do we recognize causal adverbial participles? Well, if the best translation we can think of uses the word because, it is a causal participle. On the other hand, a concessive participle is one where the best translation would use the word although. So we have here in John 9:25, hin oida hoti tuflos ein arti blepo. One thing I know, that although I was blind, now I see. From John 20. Eketai ho Jesus ton thuron keklaismenon kai este eis to meson. And Jesus came and stood in the middle, although, or even though, the door had been locked. If the best translation of a participle includes the word for the purpose of or in order that, it is going to be an adverbial participle of purpose. So, for example, in John 6, torta de elegon pyradzon orton. They said this in order to test him. Erketai Miriam, he Magdalene, angelusa tois mathetes. Mary Magdalene came in order to announce to the disciples that she had seen the Lord. Now, in the New Testament as a whole, we have adverbial participles of means, of manner, of result, and of condition. And when I was looking at the participles in John, I didn't find any of result or condition, and I only found a few examples of means or manner. All right, with an adverbial participle of means, it can be a cumbersome translation, but if the best translation includes by means of, then you have an adverbial participle of means. So take, for example, John 20:31. Torta de graptai hinapus tu saita ho Jesus estin ho Christos ho huios tu theou. But these things have been written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Kai hina pistusontes zoan ekata inter noma ortu. All right, so ignoring the participle, hina zoan ekata, and in order that you might have life. Pistusontes, by believing. All right, so you might have life by the means of belief. John 17:4. Ego se doxa epites geis to ergon teleoses ho didokas ma hina poieso. I have glorified you on earth by means of completing the works which you gave me in order that I should do them. All right, so again, that's a very cumbersome translation, but you can see that it is an adverbial participle of means. I glorified you on earth. How? By completing the works which you'd given me. Now, an adverbial participle of manner can be a relatively broad category, and we've already mentioned that you could argue many pleonastic participles could be considered to be adverbial participles of manner. Here is a very clear example, though, found in John 13:22. Eblepon eis alelelus hoi mathetai eparumenai peritinos legai. So the disciples looked at each other, perplexed about what he had said. So that's the manner in which they were looking at each other. They were just perplexed. A genitive absolute. So what is a genitive absolute? It's a phrase, and it's expressed by means of a participle in the genitive case, and everything else in the phrase that can take a case will be in the genitive case. It makes more sense when you've seen a number of them, and there are not many in John. There are many others scattered through the New Testament, though. Oh, perhaps I should also mention that examiners just love genitive absolutes. It's kind of one of those tricky things that they find interesting, and they think that their students should also find interesting. Kai huperesentos oinoi, legai he meter to Jesus pron auton. And so here is the huperesentos oinoi, they ran short of wine. And how do we translate this? Well, we translate genitive absolutes as we would a adverbial participle. They're usually translated as temporal adverbial participles, but some of the other categories of adverbial participle are also found associated with genitive absolutes. Well, In this particular case, I can think of at least three plausible ways to categorize this particular genitive absolute. It could be temporal, causal, or of attendant circumstances. Now, I think it's probably most likely to be attendant circumstances, but that happens to be the most difficult way to translate it. So if it's temporal, it means after they ran out of wine. The mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. If it's causal, it means because they ran out of wine. The mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. And it's really hard to translate the attendant circumstances case. They ran out of wine, perhaps. Anyway, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. John 13:2. Kai deipnu genomenu to diabolu eide biblikotes eis tein kardian hina paradoi orton Iudas Simonas Iscariotou. Well, here we have, as a bonus, two genitive absolutes together. Kai deipnu genomenu, when supper was finished. To diablu eida biblikotes, the devil had already put into his heart that Judas Iscariot would betray him, and then it goes on from there. So the first genitive absolute, deipnu genomenu, is clear reference to time. So it's after supper. And then we have an adverbial construction, a genitive absolute construction, which is probably attendant circumstances. This is something that had happened that we need to know about to explain the rest of the action that takes place. Now, I'm going to come back to attributive adjectival participles. And I debated whether to include this in the video or not. I thought if I was talking about all the uses of participles in John, even though there's only one of these, I should probably put it in the video. And that is one example of a predicative, attributive, adjectival participle. What do I mean by a predicative adjective? Well, a predicative adjective is like we find in Luke 16:20. Makaroi hoi tokoi. Blessed the poor. Okay, there's a word missing. Blessed are the poor. And we have here in John 12:13 a very similar construction using a participle. Eulogomenos ho erkomenos in onomati kuriou. Blessed, the one who comes in the name of the Lord. All right, so what's missing here? We want to add the word is. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. And that is like a predicative adjective. It's a predicative, attributive, adjectival participle. And I only found one in John. So as I was working through John, looking at all the participles, there were some which were challenging to classify. And I think this video would be incomplete if we didn't acknowledge that sometimes you can understand a participle in one of two or even three different ways. And as I was working through them, I gathered some examples so that I could share with you. Here's an example found in John 11, verse 31. And the Jews, those who were with her in the house and comforting her, idontis tain Miriam, hoti takios anaste kai exalthin, akoluthasin orto doxantis. So how are we to understand idontis? So I could translate it as a temporal adverbial participle. When they saw Mary get up, they followed her. Because, doxantis, because they supposed that she was going to the tomb to weep there. So I think doxantis is likely to be causal. But perhaps idontis is also causal. So you could translate it, and the Jews that were with her, because they saw Mary get up quickly and go out, they followed her because they supposed, right? So that could either be temporal or causal. sounds better in English if you do one temporal and the other causal, but either is an option. In John 20:20, we find ekeresin un hoimathetai idontes ton kurion. Therefore, the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord, or because they saw the Lord. Is it temporal, when, or causal, because? John 6:14, hoi un anthropoi idontes. So again, this could be either temporal or causal. So therefore the men, when they saw what signs Jesus had done, or therefore the men, because they saw what Jesus had done, went ahead and said, well, this is truly the prophet. Well, as we've looked at the participles in John, we see there is quite a variety of things to remember and know. And you might be asking how to make this a little bit easier. My first suggestion is that you follow the practice we have followed in this video. So start with the combinations of tense and voice and case that are most commonly found. So learn to recognize those quite freely. And then start with the most common uses, starting with the substantival, adjectival participles. Get to know them quite well, and they're going to seem straightforward. And then move through the more frequently occurring uses of the participle in John and translate out of John. And as you translate out of John, sometimes you'll need to come back and look at some of the less commonly occurring uses. By the way, it's probably easier to have a textbook which has got these listed down so you can run your eye down the different uses and pick up the different examples as well. So just a thought. The other thing that you're going to find helpful is access to exercises. And here I want to talk about a special feature of the third edition of my book, Intermediate New Testament Greek Made Easier. It has a chapter on participles, and at the end of the chapter it has exercises. Now that's not surprising in a textbook, but these exercises are divided in parts of the New Testament. So the first exercise is in fact on the book of Revelation, because the uses of participles in Revelation is pretty straightforward. Then the next exercise is on the Gospel of John, starting with the most frequent uses of the participle and then the less frequently found uses of the participle. There are some other videos that I have on participles, and I will list some of them here. And I do have one further suggestion. Might be a bridge too far for many of you, but I found using Logos to look at all the participles in John a very helpful exercise. And going through and classifying them for yourself, I think is by far the best way to understand the use of participles in John. As I say, that might be a bridge too far for many. This video is part of a series of videos on the grammar and syntax of the Greek New Testament. More of them available on YouTube and x.com. And might I suggest that you, first of all, like this video if you found it at all useful. Then you may wish to subscribe. And seeing as this is more advanced grammar, I'm not producing these very frequently, so you may want to press the bell icon so that you'll be notified when other videos are posted that deal with aspects of New Testament Greek. Thank you.